Welcome to the Parent Advocate Podcast, a show where we celebrate, defend, support, and uplift the voices of the LGBTQI community. I'm your host, Stephen Chikumba. My pronouns are he, him, and his, and I'm joined by my amazing co-host, Lisette Trujillo.
Hi, everyone. Lisette here, she, her, Ea. The mission of the Parent Advocate Podcast is to elevate conversations and reframe narratives around trans and non-binary youth to help change hearts and minds. Each week, we bring you our take on all things happening from the perspective of two parents of BIPOC transgender kids.
Lisette, this week we had oral arguments before the Supreme Court, ICE murdering people in broad daylight, and LGBTQ plus people saying that they're going back into the closet under Trump. We have a lot to talk about today.
And it's only January 16th.
I can't believe we've only been in this fuckery for less than a year. Well, let's get into it. Welcome everyone once again to the Parent Advocate Podcast. Let's get started. Lisa, I know I said it's been a packed week and we've got a lot to unpack, but before we break it all down, tell me what you've been up to since the last time we spoke.
Well, Stephen, all of last week, I was anxious awaiting, the SCOTUS hearing, life felt stressful. And so this is not an endorsement and or a paid sponsorship, but I discovered ZzzQuil. They sell it out here. It's hard to find Vicks products out here. It's melatonin and it's changed my life. I've been sleeping better, which is amazing. So that's a random. Also, there's 11 anti-trans bills in the state of Arizona. And I keep trying to see if the bill trackers across the country have been updated and they haven't. It's literally only January 16th. And next Tuesday, there's going to be about 4 or 5 anti-trans bills being heard. One of them is an expanded sports ban because trans girls have already been banned from academic sports. And now they want to expand the statewide sports ban to include club sports, anything under your city leagues, anything like that. They want to ban trans people from being able to participate. And this bill can't get vetoed by our governor. It actually, if passes, goes onto the November ballot. And so it's just action alert after action alert, hoping that people will show up and speak out and not allow this to move on to our election ballot come November 2026. And so it's been hard watching, the news back home and then hearing the reaction from the EU. I feel really worried about our families and our loved ones back home, especially as ICE is ramping up in the way that Pete Hegseth warned everyone. They said they wanted martial law and ICE in every single city across the country by April 2026, and we are in January. I just don't think people are paying enough attention. What about you?
It's interesting that you should end on that point about not feeling like people are paying attention, because I had one of the most interesting conversations with my coworker the other day who hit me up and was like, can I get some time on your calendar? I want to talk about something personal. And, I'm all for that. I'm all for breaking those barriers between work and personal, especially when people invite you in. And so this was just a regular white person at my job. And I was like, sure. And Lisette, when I tell you I was shocked by what I heard. I was shocked by what I heard. First, this person admitted that they live in MAGA town. They live in Massapequa, but they called it Magapequa. That's how red this part of New York she lives in actually is. And then she went on to express concern about this administration taking over Greenland. That's where it started. It started on Greenland. And I'm like, what a random thing to be concerned about. Not really random, but it was the opening salvo in all of the other things that were concerning her. Bombing boats in Venezuela, invading Venezuela, kidnapping their leader, ICE shooting people in the streets, all of these things. And she said that she woke up and she turned to her husband and she just started crying because the emotional weight of all the things that were happening were actually getting to her. And she realized that I was the one person she knew she could talk to because I do advocacy. And it is impacting people. People are being impacted. People are having visceral, unplanned, unanticipated responses to what's happening because what's happening is not normal. This week alone, we have had multiple conversations with people grappling with what's happening in the world. Outside of SCOTUS, trans women are being attacked and in the moment assumed to be the bad actor. And it's not until other people testify and they consult the video, like, let's review the video and see, oh, wow, that cisgender man actually attacked that trans woman and it wasn't the other way around. And so, notwithstanding a lot of the stuff we hear on the news, a lot of the stuff we're seeing, it's not actually reflective of what's actually happening. Literally, minutes before we joined, I just saw something about Fox News editing what the mayor of Minnesota actually said regarding ICE. Laura Ingraham had the audacity to go on Fox News and play an edited clip in which the mayor purportedly says to basically attack the police, when in fact, Fox News cut up the video in order to have that statement made. This is what we're dealing with. We are dealing with intentional propaganda, people being intentionally incited to violence by bad actors left and right. And so this week, for me, has been a particularly eye-opening one because I knew the rot was deep. But I didn't know it was like cancerous and bilious and so ingrained, so deeply ingrained in people's psyche that they're simply almost incapable of extricating themselves from it, of discerning what's true from false. And when you have bad actors on top of that, it becomes even more difficult.
Stephen, I'm so glad that you bring all this up because there were multiple days where I couldn't fall asleep until 4 or 5 in the morning. And I was telling Jose that one night my algorithm changed 3 times on Instagram, like literally. So it started off with normal people I follow, right? And then it went into potential nuclear war with Iran, which was terrifying. And like, you know, all the jets in the UK and fighter planes in the UK and the EU's response around Greenland. And everyone was like, we will be dead and nuked by the next day. And then my algorithm changed to aliens and Joe Rogan telling people that the second coming of Christ was going to happen on the internet. And I'm like, what in the world is happening? And the chaos I felt, I mean, I literally was stressed out the next day. I slept maybe 3 hours. I was scared about, you know, because we're in a walking city. Daniel has to travel to school. And on like a silver lining note, he applied to college in another city for next year and he has his final interview next week. And so I'm like dreading like what is going to happen to the world if we have nuclear war and if, you know, the chaos and everything. And so I think a lot of people are experiencing this in real time. And I think luckily for you and I, we have access to accurate information because we're in advocacy spaces, we're in talks with legal people, we're in talks with politicians, and we are aware of what's propaganda and what's not. And most people are not. And so I'm so glad that you bring this up. How did your conversation end?
It's interesting you should ask that question as well, because a lot of what I ended up doing was telling her exactly what you just said. People who really understand what's going on understand that we're not poking the bear, as it were, to bring on nuclear Armageddon. Although the person in the Oval Office is clearly batshit crazy and without restraint, superpowers recognize that it's just one. One will take out the whole globe, and so nobody really wants that. And as fatalistic as this idiot may be, everyone else is not as fatalistic. And so folks beyond these borders are proceeding with a certain degree of caution, and they're saying, hey, you know what? We don't need America anymore. We can do business with other countries which have other resources and leave these jokers to their own devices, which is essentially what's going to happen. The isolationism that this dude is looking for, he will get, and it will inure to our detriment. But I told her essentially that war is not really imminent. And if she's really concerned about what she can do, she can call her congresspeople. She can call her elected officials. If she's worried about how people, citizens are being impacted, then she should focus on the ones that are really being impacted. Focus on organizations that provide support for women's reproductive rights. Focus on LGBTQ plus serving organizations. Focus on organizations that serve gender expansive people who are losing access to care. Focus on organizations that absolutely positively could use your dollars now. She's middle class like me. She's working. Her husband's working. She's got generally older kids. And so I was just like, if you want to feel like you're doing something, do something. If you feel like there's people you can talk to who you can actually reach, the movable middle, talk to them. But don't waste your time talking to the brick walls. Leave them alone and tune out. Take a break from the news. Take a break from social media. Hug your kids. Kiss your husband. Play Parcheesi or put together a puzzle. But do things to bring your cortisol down, to help yourself regulate. because that is what they're looking for. Chaos is the point. And so if you're all in a frenzy and in a tizzy because of what you're watching, stop watching it. Stop giving it the energy that you're giving it, and you will find that you feel better. You know, we live in a space where the news cycle is intended to draw responses. It's not intended to share real information, because we would learn about all the good things that are happening in the world alongside the bad thing. It would be some level of democracy, some evenness in reporting. All we get is negative stuff all the time. And so, of course, that's going to dysregulate you. So I gave her all of these really important tips that we as parents in support spaces give to our families, because if you just pay attention to the news, you'll be miserable. And so it's important every once in a while to stop doom scrolling, to get off social media, to take a walk, to listen to some music, to hug the people that you love, so that you understand what this is all for. But we could talk about how we talk people off ledges all day. But how about we get into today's topics?
I can't wait. Let's do it.
All right. So, Lisa, as you know, I was on the steps of the Supreme Court for oral arguments in the cases of BBJ versus West Virginia and Little versus Hecox, two cases which center around whether or not laws that limit participation in women and girls sports to those assigned female at birth violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and otherwise essentially preclude active participation for all members of our society in sports.
You know, Stephen, I haven't listened to the audio of the hearing, but what I found really interesting was listening to Amara kind of pinpoint two really important and dangerous things that came out of this, which was the first one being that the opposition, Alliance Defending Freedom, wants a clear definition of gender to be entered into the Constitution that would require proof, putting the burden on individuals in hopes of probably excluding trans people, intersex people, anyone who has any chromosomal, variants. And the second being that if you are part of a small minority, that you should not be fully protected under the Constitution and or have equal rights. And so that to me was alarming. And I haven't had a chance to see it. And I felt a lot of guilt around not being able to be there with you all, especially after hearing what happened to one of our good friends and co-conspirators. I had heard from multiple sources that the opposition was really hostile. It says a lot about where we are politically and what this administration gives permission for people to do and how to behave, which is hateful. And it makes being visible scary for many, many people.
So let's talk about that for a second. In our intro, I talked about the trans woman who was essentially assaulted by a counter protester, someone who showed up for the anti-trans side of the aisle, who shoved this trans woman. And immediately they were surrounded by police, and she was presumed to be the aggressor. And despite the fact that there were so many people who were actually telling the cops that the contrary was true, it wasn't until they literally went to the videos, because there were cameras all over. There's cameras all over the Supreme Court. On every corner, on every building, on every flag post, there's cameras. And so they were able to see very clearly that no, this trans woman did not shove this white man. This white man, in fact, shoved this trans woman because that side is simply incapable of controlling themselves. And it was only then that that individual was taken into custody and she was released. And I can only imagine how she must have felt, because you got to know there were snipers on the building of the Supreme Court looking at us with binoculars the whole time. There were flanks of police on either side. Unlike the last time when we were at Scrimeti, which was a very different vibe, very different energy from this time, it was very clear. The police presence, which is always present, was very clearly aligned with one side, because the rapidness with which they responded to that tells you everything about where their mind is with respect to trans people and our ability to show up in spaces and fight. The police presence, which is always there, seemed fixated on the trans activist side, this new domestic terrorist side, versus the people who actually engaged in acts of domestic terror, which is the right, the Christian nationals, right, the anti-trans right, the people who actually stormed the Capitol. And so I found it interesting that, notwithstanding all the evidence to the contrary, especially that experienced by Capitol Police, who were the ones assaulted on January 6th, they would be trained on us.
Yeah. I mean, the erosion of democracy is coming from Christian nationalists, but that's for a different episode. I will tell you, I did reach out to her and she just told me she was so grateful that community was there. She felt supported. She felt embraced by everyone and that she's okay, which is a relief. But you don't think that that's going to happen on the foot of the Supreme Court. And it's terrifying, especially when you are there already as a marginalized person. I think what people don't understand about what has happened in the last, 6-7 years is that trans people did not have full protections. And what we started to see were trans youth winning in the courts, gaining access to protections and access to participation in school. And so the courts were helping expand the rights and privileges of transgender people because that didn't exist before, right? And so people are like, why is this an issue? Because lobbies like Heritage Foundation, Alliance Defending Freedom, and so forth made this an issue because they didn't want transgender people to gain equal rights in our nation. And so this was a message I used to get all the time on like Facebook and Instagram. Finally said, tell me how transgender people don't have rights. And I was like, oh, you think I'm being alarmist? Like, okay, I'll tell you how, right? Or I was talking to my mom this morning and I was telling her that I was really annoyed by this anti-trans bill that just popped up in our state that's an anti-drag bill. But really, it says that anyone wearing articles of clothing that do not match their biological sex and then stand in a crowd with children in public are groomers, and it's a public deviance. You know what I mean? And my mom's like, they would never do that. And I was like, no, the 3 article of clothing law existed in our nation for decades. That is how they incarcerated transgender people all the time. And so there's this idea that equality exists. And I tell people that what has happened in the US is that we've glorified people who have had to fight, who've been beaten, who've had to push the needle forward in order to gain some level of equality. We've glorified that action and normalized it without actually critically thinking, why do people have to fight for equal protections that I already have?
I'm going to jump in here because one of the things you talked about when Amar gave her summary of the arguments and really the tone of those arguments was about this erosion of rights. People don't get that what they're doing is going to affect everybody. I don't know how many times and how many ways we have to say this. The bathroom bills, just as a starting point, here's a simple way for you to understand how bad they are. Cisgender women can't go to the bathroom without being accosted. Cisgender women can no longer go to the bathroom without being accosted by the body police. Children will no longer be able to participate in sports without being accosted. Cisgender children will no longer be able to participate in sports without being accosted. And who's going to do the accosting? White men. Mm-hmm. White men. The gatekeepers are white men. Mm-hmm. Who are the rapists? White men. Who are the pedophiles? White men. Who are the sexual assaulters? White men. Who are the perverts? White men. People need to stop equating cis white men and their perversion with trans women and any gender expansive people, because gender expansive people are not cisgender men. Right. And all of the things that people are ascribing to trans women specifically are whole projection of the behaviors of white men on this marginalized community. None of those things, pedophilia, rape, sexual assault, human trafficking, is not going to stop. None of that's going to stop by you going after trans women. That's going to continue unabated because the problem is them. It's not these other things that they're distracting you with and having you have all these opinions and come out to rallies to fight and argue about, when in fact none of that is meaningful. We are talking about less than 1%. Because if the whole, let's just say the entire transgender population is 2% of America. Let's just say it's 2%. Young people are maybe half of that. So that's 1% of the population is trans youth. What percent of that population plays sports? An infinitesimal amount of people. And so we've spent years and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on ads and lobbyists to prevent this small group of people from using the bathroom, from playing sports, from having gender affirming care for fucking what?
Yeah, exactly.
And Now we're at the Supreme Court arguing yet another case that's going to take yet more rights away from trans people for fucking what? When you don't understand that what you are doing is you're creating the template to remove the rights from anybody they want at any time, period.
And I love that you bring up bathrooms because, bathroom segregation is not new, right? It's the entry point of oppression. And so people should be weary. If they really care about democracy, that should be the first thing that alarms them.
Lisa, I cannot tell you how many times I go into my comments. I wrote this Substack article. Yes, those are cops outside the women's room. And it was a picture taken from the Texas Tribune, which showed 3 state troopers standing outside the women's bathroom in the state building in Austin. And so many people were like, well, I don't want a man in the bathroom. What are they doing there? They shouldn't be coming to the bathroom. I feel safer with the cops. And all of these comments go to things that are just not happening. They're not happening. You don't have trans women assaulting cisgender women in the bathroom. It's just not happening. If it were happening, then yes, let's create a law to stop it. But let's not make up a law for a problem that doesn't exist and say we're protecting women in the process, because that's not what's happening. But the fact that so many people are willing to jump on the bandwagon of ignorance without actually knowing the data, what it actually says, what these laws are actually going to do, it's alarming the extent to which people will act against their own self-interest for a cause that I can't explain why they would jump behind it. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
It doesn't make any sense. And it's a reminder of the fact that when you don't teach people the accurate history of our nation, they have short memories and forget. And we're not just talking about Jim Crow laws. Like, bathroom segregation existed across the Southwest and the South, all the way up to California for decades. And so if you can't pee in public, you can't exist in public life. And it's as simple as that. And that's the point. It's to ensure that you don't have access to public life. And people just don't understand that concept. I also think, when we're talking about participation in sports, this is where I always have to remind people, they chose sports and they chose gender affirming care because they understood that if you could reduce people to just body parts, to just the rhetoric and propaganda of adult male, that you could scare people. And the reality is that there are no adult males in 6th grade basketball.
There are no adult males going into the ladies' bathroom.
And so if you can reduce people to body parts, you can discriminate against them. And that's what's really frustrating. The conversation and the propaganda is just about people's body parts and people's discomfort with certain body parts. And the reality is that then you no longer see a whole human being. You don't. You just see propaganda and fear. And, we also have a hard time looking at things as they are. If you're worried about men assaulting women in spaces, then you need to really consider what you're saying about our culture, that your fear is men. Maybe we need to think about how we're raising men.
They're never going to admit that.
I heard something really powerful the other day. It was a leader in Latino America, and he said, "We are not poor countries. We're not shithole countries. Nations do not invade poor countries. They come to us to strip us of our resources and our wealth." And I just thought, yeah, that's what we should be questioning. But we as a society take the news at face value without being critical about it in any kind of way.
Lisa, that's a whole nother episode. That's a whole nother episode. Let's get on with our show.
All right, Stephen. On January 7th, 2026, a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agent fatally shot 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good during a federal enforcement operation in Minneapolis. Her death has ignited widespread controversy. It's ignited protests across the country. And in saying that, I also want to remind people that she was one of 4 people who had already been shot. And there was another immigrant from Venezuela in Minneapolis who was shot the following day. And so as we're seeing this uptick in ICE violence, I can't say enough how grateful I am that people are finally standing up and protesting across this country.
It is terrifying to see what has previously only been the violence directed towards Black and brown people being applied indiscriminately to white people in America as well. Because when they don't care about white lives either, that is when we know tyranny has firmly established itself on U.S. soil. I want to say that again because I want to make sure people are listening. You should all be terrified when they're no longer going after the Stephen and Lisettes of the world, but they're also going after Chad and Janet, because that is when you know beyond the shadow of a doubt that they do not care about you at all. That little slogan, all lives matter, was crap.
And crafted propaganda.
When they're arresting U.S. citizens and throwing them in paddy wagons and detention with the illegals, you know shit's fucked up. When they're arresting priests and pepper spraying children at high schools in broad daylight, when they are terrorizing neighborhoods all across America with impunity, and then the president and the vice president and the secretary of Homeland Security all get on TV and talk about how all of these people were domestic terrorists, you know tyranny has established a firm foothold on the soil of America, and you should be terrified.
I think what was really terrifying for a lot of people, and I think just a reminder for us POC folks, was a white pastor saying that he was pulled into a van, driven around, terrorized, yelled at, and then told, "You're white, so you wouldn't be fun to kill anyway." I mean,
that's some shit. And so folks know that we are not being sensationalist. You can look this up yourself. You can go find the pastor yourself who was picked up, thrown in a van, just assaulted in this way, and who recounts his experience. We said there was a realtor, a white realtor. He and his wife make all these funny TikTok videos about selling real estate, driving around their town, who just happened to be following ICE. They snatched dude up out of his car, threw him in a van, threw him on the ground, scratched up his face, held this fool for 24 hours. His wife was making the videos. She's a cameraman. She's now making videos being like, yo, they just took dude. They just took Chad and arrested him. Regular, degular white people being treated like they have been treating people of color for centuries. So if it's not connecting yet for y'all that this administration doesn't give a fuck about you, and that what we've been telling you, which has been happening to marginalized people for time immemorial, is not going to stop at marginalized people, and you just pushard it away and you acted like it doesn't have anything to do with you, motherfuckers, wake up. It has everything to do with all of us. It is us versus them, and the them is that ultra rich, ultra wealthy ivory tower top percent of the world, and we are the victims of their unbridled greed.
Yes, you're 100 on all of this.
I'm just saying, like, I could not reconcile myself to what I saw, the unnecessary killing of this young woman in the street like a dog by this super angry, ill-trained, and that's fucked up too. I say ill-trained, he was a firearms instructor. This was a man who trained other people. So if this is the trainer, how do you think the people he trained respond in those situations? Are they de-escalating? No. Are they shooting only when life is absolutely at risk? Or just fucking bitch? This is what we're dealing with. And if you do not have concerns, or if you're one of these people who inexplicably are defending ICE,
I don't have words. People, this is where I get upset with the short memory. During all the Black Lives Matter protests, what was happening? Unmarked Border Patrol vans were coming around and scooping up organizers, scooping people up. Mass protest was occurring then, and it only under this administration does it have to be this because they're about terrorizing communities. And so people are like, we've never seen this. No. You saw this in 2016. You saw this happening. You saw when Trump threw whatever those gas things were at protesters to move out of the way and hold a Bible upside down. Like, we know what's at stake. And now it's just escalated. And people voted for this. People voted for this again.
Lisa, the thing is that the tactics of this country are unfortunately having the desired effect. And when I say that, I'm talking about a recent survey of LGBTQ plus people, which has established beyond a shadow of a doubt that people are afraid to be out. People have said in no uncertain terms that they are being very conscious about where they are out and who they are out with, and essentially going back into the closet. LGBTQ plus Americans are increasingly retreating back into the closet under Donald Trump's second term, with nearly half LGBTQ plus adults reporting that they're less out in areas like work, healthcare, and public life amid declining visibility and growing concern over policies affecting their rights and safety. We have been talking about this exact thing. You go to the Supreme Court for a rally, someone shoves you, and the police immediately think you're the person who did it because you're trans, because you're queer, or because you're gender expansive. So now being out and open and visible literally means you have a target on your back. Literally means that you can be, in certain states, discriminated against intentionally under the color of law and have zero recourse. Imagine in 2026, we are living like we are in the Jim Crow era. And people hear these things and they're like, you're being dramatic. I'm not being dramatic. I'm talking about a time when it was legal to bar Black people from certain spaces, to require certain people to accept less than under the color of law. These are things that people don't realize happened in this country not very long ago that are happening again. The fact that our president says that the civil rights era hurt white people very badly means that this dude is a fucking idiot of history who does not understand that A, no it didn't, B, no it didn't, and C, no it fucking didn't. I can't. This episode has me so hot.
I know. Stephen, I want to remind our listeners, our non-BIPOC listeners who are like, I'm losing my ability to kind of follow what they're talking about because this isn't my lived experience. I want to tell those people, you can read a book called The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone by Heather McGhee. You can get it on Audible. She has a podcast where she goes through every chapter, where she talks about the fact that racism impacts everyone at every level, right? All it does is create a caste system that allows you to say, not me for today, but it harms everyone. And it's for economic gain, which is awful, right? That's just a tidbit. I think too, what you're talking about in terms of people going back into the closet has a lot to do with what we're seeing in the news. Like, for example, the Lemkin Institute. It's called the Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention. And what they put out a report last week that said that we were in the early to mid stages of genocidal process against trans, non-binary, intersex people. And obviously they had to pull down their report because people got scared, right? They're like, genocide, because when we hear that, we think about what happened to people in World War II, right? What happened to Jewish people, queer people, people who were outside of the margins and were attacked by the Nazi regime. And what they're saying is when there is a ripple of laws that marginalize people so much that they cannot exist in public life, that begins to strip them, right? Like, we forget that, like, what made the Nazis powerful was the fact that they passed a bunch of laws that removed people from public life, right? Jewish people from public life. And so, when we see these kinds of institutes put out alarming kind of reports that are saying, like, this is where we're at and people need to pay attention, no wonder LGBTQI people are saying, I can't exist in public. My safety literally is in harm's way. And I think that I understand that, like, people they're afraid of losing things. They're afraid of losing their jobs, their livelihood, their homes. And as somebody who left everything behind to start over for my child's safety, I can tell you it does feel like the worst thing that could ever happen to you. And at the same time, we're getting to a point where people are going to have to make tough decisions about how to protect themselves and protect their communities and how to support people who are being impacted by this escalation in violence that we're seeing in cities across our incredible country.
I'm glad you brought up this conversation about genocide, because I do think that there are certain trigger words that people start to think we are being hyperbolic when we use. But the use of genocide, the term genocide, to describe what's happening to trans people in particular, is accurate when you understand that it is the systematic elimination and eradication of people from public life. It doesn't mean they're being killed. It means that every attempt is being made to destroy their access to life, liberty, and happiness. And it is being done by the system. It is being done by the powers that be. It is not an accidental thing. It's an intentional infliction of policies, procedures, and practices meant to disenfranchise and eradicate people's presence from public life. And so, yes, it is genocidal to have the federal government enacting policies that literally define people out of existence. If you do not exist on paper, by law, you do not exist. If you cannot go to court and have standing to bring a legal case, a criminal case, or a civil case to protect your rights or to seek redress, then you do not exist. And if you don't exist on paper and therefore you have no right, no redress, no recourse, that is a genocide. And so people need to stop being triggered by words and actually pay attention to the meaning of the word. Why did they use that word? Why are they calling it a genocide? Why are they using the term biological male instead of trans female? Why did they do that? This child is 7 that identifies as trans. Why are you calling this 7-year-old trans girl a biological male? Why are you suggesting that this 7-year-old girl is going to be somehow dangerous to women in the women's bathroom? When you take these things to their logical conclusion, you realize that it's bullshit. But people don't do that. They just attach to the words and they run off and spout their opinions. And like you said, opinions are like assholes. You didn't say those exact words, but that's what you meant when you said it. Everybody has one. And so I'm very concerned when I read a report that says LGBTQ plus people are afraid to be out in this country any longer. And I know it's for a good reason, because they're increasingly coming under attack and they're increasingly being put in harm's way simply by living their truth. And that is unacceptable in a country where it's the land of the free. Free for some, obviously, and not for others.
Exactly. And so we need to quit working backwards and just give equality to all people.
Hear, hear. Now it's time for our recurring segment, Allies and Assholes, where we highlight individuals and groups who are supporting the LGBTQI community on the one hand and call out straight up assholes who are trying to move us all backwards on the other. Lisette, who are we talking about today?
Stephen, I'm so excited about our Ally of the Week because I am part of this organization and I believe deeply in its mission and in the movement, and that is the Gender Liberation Movement. This January marks the first anniversary of GLM, a grassroots volunteer-run collective focused on expanding transgender rights, bodily autonomy, and coalition building with other justice movements across the U.S. GLM's first year was defined by bold, direct actions, including sit-ins, rallies, and protests against anti-trans laws and policies, often resulting in arrests and strategic efforts to shift narratives and strengthen grassroots infrastructure. GLM's founders and activists focus on meeting political repression with organized resistance and joy as they continue to push for liberation and resist efforts to erase trans people's rights.
Lisa, can I tell you that I didn't know that GLM was just a year old, because the work that they do is like OG on the ground movements work from seasoned professionals who've been in these advocacy streets forever. And so to learn that Eliel and Raquel have been doing this for a year and to know all of what they've done in that year, I was so impressed. I am so impressed. And I was so excited when I learned that this was their 1-year anniversary.
I'm super excited. And for those of us listening, if you want to join our Affirming Adult Circle and or Trans Youth Space, you can email us at info@genderlib.org. And this is why the Gender Liberation Movement is our Ally of the Week.
Congratulations to the Gender Liberation Movement. And now on to our asshole of the week. Our asshole of the week is the University of Arkansas. The University of Arkansas rescinded its offer to hire Emily Susky as dean of its law school after state legislators and other conservative figures objected to her signing an amicus brief supporting the rights of transgender athletes. Susky had been announced as the new dean, but the university cited external feedback about her, air quotes, fit for the job in reversing its course, a decision that critics say reflects political pressure rather than her qualifications. Opponents of the decision, including lawmakers and civil liberties groups, argue that withdrawing the offer undermines academic freedom and punishes her for her views on transgender inclusion.
Stephen, educators, professors, anyone involved in education and academia need a raise. They have been at the front line year after year, fighting for the rights of transgender youth, fighting for inclusion, fighting for equitable access to education. They're just trying to do their job and to teach people and give people skills. This is ridiculous. And so, boo and screw the University of Arkansas.
What's really disturbing to me is that this is the second incident in as many weeks where we've talked about a university engaging in practices that are like literally the antithesis of what academia is for. Here you have a professor who submitted an amicus brief, which means that she went out of her way to state her opinion on an issue that has real public import, to write a brief in support of trans inclusion in sports, because this is important. If we do not know anything about how rights are formed, they're formed when marginalized groups get attacked and people step to the fore and say, hey, these people should be included, and here's why: because we live in a just, equal society, or we should aspire to. And to penalize a professor who is actually espousing serious, informed, critical legal thought because her opinion offends some snowflake members of the right who want us to move backwards is really alarming. And actually, it's probably going to inure to her benefit to not be affiliated with this backwards ass law school, because at the end of the day, at some point, she's going to be handicapped. She's going to be prevented from teaching the truth to these kids. And if these are going to be our future jurists, they need to be able to hear about the ways in which this country falls short of that promise under the color of law, because it happens time and time again.
And educators know that they're the light, right? They remind us and teach us our history, the knowledge, the things that we need to know. And that is why they're continuously targeted, because this administration, these kinds of people who are pushing an agenda, do not want people to learn, do not want people to be able to think critically, do not want people to hear a sentence and to be able to question how it's being framed. And so, like I said, when the world turns around, teachers should be paid more than anybody else. And so that's my little tidbit on that.
And this is why the University of Arkansas is our asshole of the week. Well, that's our show for today, folks. I got to give it up to my co-host, Lisette Trujillo, for really engaging in some of these hard conversations with me. And even though they don't always feel good, it's good that we have them.
Stephen, it's therapeutic. And you know that I couldn't do this without you, and that we couldn't do this without our listeners. So thank you for tuning in to the Parent Advocate podcast.
And folks, please be sure to subscribe to our Substack and YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram and TikTok, and do everything you got to do to stay up to date with everything going on here at the Parent Advocate Podcast. Goodbye.
Bye.